and Betty and the Nancys and Bills and Joes and Janes will find in the study of science a richer, more rewarding life.
Hey, welcome to Inquiring Minds. I'm Indre. This is a podcast where we explore the space where science and society collide. We want to find out what's true, what's left to discover, and why it matters. The farm-to-table trend has been in fashion for several decades now, and we tend to revere food whose source is known to us. But there's a less well-known part of that journey, and that's the to part. What happens in the in-between once the food has left the farm but hasn't yet made it into the kitchen? We tend to think that it's a pretty direct route from the market or even the dirt to the kitchen, but that's far from true, as you're soon going to find out, even for the freshest food. We last spoke to Nicola Twilley, one of my favorite science journalists, about quarantine during the pandemic. But well before her last book, she was already working on this one, all about refrigeration. So today, at long last, we get to chat about a project that she's been working on for 15 years. Her new book, Frostbite: How Refrigeration Changed Our Food, Our Planet, and Ourselves, is out now. Nikki, welcome back to Inquiring Minds.
Thank you for having me. Yes, and the relief of finally being done with this book. It's so huge. I was reliving it while you were talking.
It's such an interesting journey to places I think most of our listeners, I certainly have never been in or thought about or even knew existed. And I want to jump straight into that first sort of vignette that you open the book with in this massive refrigeration area in Ontario, California. Tell us about it. How did you discover it? What was it like to work in this massive refrigerator?
So as part of, the process of figuring out where our food lives between the farm and the table, I mean, and it really did start from this curiosity of like, what are these spaces we built for our food to live in and we never go and see them? I spent a week doing shift work at an Americold warehouse. Americold is, I think, the second largest cold storage company globally. And so they have refrigerated warehouses all over the US and all over the world. And they have a bunch in Southern California, of course, because there are a lot of people here and we all need to eat. And so I worked in one for a week, and it's going to sound very basic, but it is incredibly cold. And they give you the gear, they give you the hat and the gloves and the boots, and more importantly, the jacket that is rated down to -50 and was literally the single most hideous piece of clothing I own. And yet all of it together, I was still freezing. And I think part of what was so interesting to me about this was just realizing these are spaces that no one goes inside of. This part of our food system is literally invisible, and the people who work there are too. And they felt that themselves. We'd be sitting there at lunch break talking about the Golden State Warriors or other things on which I'm not really qualified to have an opinion. And they would say, I go to the store and I look at the yogurts or the frozen pizzas or, any of the millions of things that we'd been moving around that morning. And I think to myself, if it wasn't for me, those would never be here. They couldn't get here without me, and no one knows. And it's really true. It's a weird world. It has its own kind of smell, even its own sound. There's just this constant roar of the refrigeration and the fans, and then this beeping of the forklift trucks. The floors are slippery with ice crystals. Everything is in this perpetual kind of blue-gray gloom because light emits heat, of course. So they keep it very kind of dark. So you're in this frigid gray darkness. No one could really describe the smell to me, but once you've smelled it, you will never forget it. And everyone is just like, "Oh, it's the smell of cold," but it's it's a sort of irony, metallic smell. But yeah, it's a funny, and everyone has little icicles in their facial hair. Everyone's nose is bright red. You all look like Rudolph. It's just a whole world unto itself, and there's 5.5 billion cubic feet of it, which makes it practically a third pole. So there's this entire refrigerated, like artificial winter that we built for our food to live in, and yeah, going to see it was just sort of how it started. Like that was my curiosity. Was what does this look like?
And there's this saying that there's no such thing as bad weather, only bad gear. And that kept like running through my mind as I was reading that first chapter, because it doesn't seem to be true. I mean, I would think that you would have the best gear you could if was your job. And yet you describe that like a lot of the employees leave at the first lunch break because they just can't handle the cold. And that even the ones that stay are just get used to being cold. It's not like they have the gear that prevents them from feeling cold. They just get used to it.
Exactly. Because it is really cold and you're in there for just such a long amount of time. And I also think there's something particularly, I mean, this, like you said, the gear I was wearing is made by a company called Refrigeration, which makes basically all the cold storage gear, but it's also worn by, people who work in the super deep levels of mines that are very cold. It's worn by sled racers. It's worn, it's used. It gets tested in the same facilities where, your North Face jacket is. And it's rated down to -50. But there's something about, I mean, the frozen pizza, if you're working in reshelving and, pulling pallets of frozen pizza, it's -20 in there. I mean, and you're not, it's not like you're focused on what's my next handhold on this mountain. You are literally moving pallets of frozen pizza around. So, and you're in there for hours. And I think it really gets to you.
The other thing that surprised me was that you talked not just about the smell of the cold, which I imagine, this is an artificially refrigerated environment. So there's going to be some chemical smell about, not that they're just pumping chemicals, but they're using,
Right.
manufactured tools to create the cold. But you were also describing the fact that the smell of pizza didn't leave your clothing for days. And that I was like, wait, what? Because when I bring pizza home from the supermarket, I don't feel like I smell it until I cook it. So like, what is that all about?
Well, so it's a sheer factor of scale. And I think that's part of the refrigerated warehouse that really is most kind of overwhelming, too, is just that you
Hmm.
are surrounded. When you go to the store, you might see more frozen pizzas than you personally would eat, I don't know, in a year, maybe in a lifetime. In a refrigerated warehouse, you see more pizzas than you can have previously ever imagined even existed. I mean, there's just, we're talking about like canyons of pizza. It's 6 stories high above you. It's either side of you, pallets of more and more pizza, and that much salami and pepperoni. They can't even store ice cream in the same room because the smell transfers. So there's a lot of rules about what gets stored where. You can't have cooked above raw, and you can't contaminate. Your allergens can't go near each other and all that sort of thing. But the number one rule is nothing goes in the pizza room but pizza.
Which is kind of amazing to think about, that is the smelliest food.
Yeah, fully. Absolutely. I have not had a frozen pizza since, I'll tell you. So,
One of the other things that I thought was really fascinating in that first chapter, and I think it kind of goes to, it'll speak to the entirety of your book for people that work in this too in between state, um, which is the fact that your brain slows down, that everything literally slows down, including your thought process. And so you literally have to account for the fact that you're going to be cold stupid when you're working in these jobs.
I mean, I kind of thought this was amazing. And of course, cold works. It preserves things by slowing stuff down. I mean, that's literally how it works, right? It slows for fruit and vegetables. It slows down how fast they're metabolizing, how fast they're respiring. For meat, it's slowing down how fast bacteria and fungi are reproducing. So I knew that was how cold worked, but realizing that, like, of course I'm also organic matter, and I too will be slowed down by the cold. And it's absolutely true. You are the the guys who make the work plans at Americold have to take into account these slowed response times. Um, People call it the umbles. You grumble, fumble, mumble, and stumble in the cold. It's a universal phenomenon. I was amazed to see that. For example, the ocean's top predators, they all cluster in the coldest parts of the ocean. And it's not because they just find the cold super refreshing. It's because their prey fish there are slower and dumber and easier to catch. And it's absolutely the case for humans too. And what was funny is because right now, you see all this, the benefits of ice plunges and open water swimming and athletes doing like ice bucket things after working out, and cold can make you even lose weight and reverse your diabetes and all these miraculous things that you see. And I was like, well, wait a minute. How is it that working in the cold isn't doing all these amazing things for me? But it's actually very physiologically taxing to work in the cold. I talked to the exercise scientists who are finding all these miraculous, things, impacts of cold, and they were like, the point is you're not working. You are sitting in the cold or splashing, maybe you dip yourself in the cold. If you have to work in the cold for hours on end, then that has been connected to all sorts of negative health impacts. I mean, your blood is flowing more slowly, it's thicker, it's constricted. Your muscles tear more easily in the cold. They're sort of more fragile and prone to ripping. There's a whole levels of various stress hormones go up. There's a whole set of kind of negative impacts that life in the cold is just tough.
And then you still recognize, though, that the person that you were that was leading you through, I can't remember his name, looked a lot younger than his years. That
I
there did seem
know.
to be a kind of preservation. It was like, wait a
It was
minute, like
amazing. I guess he asked me to guess how old he was, the Americold, the warehouse manager, and I mean, admittedly, I'm a journalist. I was being polite. So I didn't want to guess too high, but I guessed a full decade younger than he was. And he was like, I love the cold. It preserves me. Like all of our guys look young. And I was like, and then another guy was like, oh yeah, it takes all my aches and pains away, like an ice pack. But I feel like maybe you say what you need to say to, I mean, a lot of them were like, this is a tough job. They wouldn't wish it on anyone. They wouldn't recommend it to, I mean, it's warehouse work is already some of the most dangerous work in America. And then you add the challenges of working in the cold. It's a really tough job.
And then that also got me thinking about sort of the logistical issues, I think, that you're unveiling with this book is, as I sort of mentioned, alluded to in my intro, where we tend to think of food as being fresh if it has a short journey between farm and our table. And so even within California, it feels like I live in California. And so if I buy California food, I don't imagine that it's ever actually been refrigerated, but your book showed me that that's totally incorrect.
Totally
So,
incorrect. Yeah.
yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah. So, tell us when food actually gets refrigerated, even when we think it's more, where it's unlikely, or that we think that it's counterintuitive that it should be refrigerated, and how that impacts the food itself.
Well, so, I mean, even food we don't think is refrigerated gets refrigerated at some point along the chain. So it's roughly 75% of everything we eat passes through what is called the cold chain at some point on its way to us. And so the cold chain is the sort of overall industry name for all of the cold spaces our food moves through. So that is everything from the supermarket chill cabinet where you pick it out, but also the refrigerated warehouse where I worked, but also the refrigerated trucks, the refrigerated shipping containers and trains and air cargo holds, but also things like on the farm. A refrigerator, a strawberry or a green bean, it will be cooled within an hour or two of being harvested. So you go to the fields around Oxnard, it's here in California, it's all strawberries. They're California strawberries. You think they're fresh. They have within an hour or two of being harvested, they are being vacuum cooled. It's called pre-cooling to get what's called the field heat out of them. Because if they carry on breathing at the same pace that they were on the plant and now they're not on the plant, they are just going to burn through all of their internal reserves. And that is the sugar and the vitamins and the nutrients and the flavor that we want. So you really have to slow their breathing down right away and keep it there. And we've become, I mean, this is another thing, you read about these Silicon Valley billionaires and their life extension protocols and the extent, the efforts people go to live longer. Well, we know everything about how to extend like an apple's life or a blueberry's life. It's incredible. And their life extension regimes are so much more involved. I mean, we're at the point where we build entire warehouses that basically apples control with their own breath. So the apple breathes out, and that tells the building how to tweak the atmosphere and the temperature so that that apple lives just a little bit longer. So I mean, they're called controlled atmosphere warehouses. The industry is like, yeah, sure, but that is what's happening in those buildings. The entire atmosphere is being determined by the respiration rate of the apples in it to extend their life for as long as possible. And that's why when you go to the store in, July and you buy an American apple, and that apple is coming up on its first birthday. It was harvested nearly a year ago and it's fresh, That's
Yeah.
which people are sort of shocked when you tell them. Like, but if you think about it, hey, when are apples harvested? We know apples are harvested in the fall. So if you're buying an American apple in July, what do you think is happening? But we
Yeah, and
don't think about it.
yeah, and to me, it was like reading that part was like, oh, it's like this notion that the apples are controlling us rather than us controlling the apples. The apples are utilizing the humans to extend their lifespan in this kind of evolutionary way. But it reminded me of one time I did go to upstate New York, and I thought, oh, it's like the fall, so I'm gonna have like the freshest apples. But the farmers there were like, no, no, these are the apples that literally have been sitting in refrigeration for a year, and these are the better apples. Like, you don't want the ones that like there's like this whole process. I was like, wait, what? Like, it sounds totally counterintuitive.
Well, traditionally, you'd let an apple almost like cure or age a little bit for some
Hmm.
extra sweetness. It's the same with meat. You think, oh, slaughter an animal, eat an animal, that's as fresh as it can get. No. Um, you know, the meat folks will all say, no, there's an entire, physiological biochemical process whereby muscle turns into meat, something we want to
Hmm.
eat. And that takes time and it has to happen in the cold. And so that's what's going on when you refrigerate meat and why you don't want to just slaughter something and eat it that evening.
What are some of the parts of that kind of where's the beef chain that you found really surprising? I mean, to me, I think it is we do have this notion that meat spoils, and so we need to keep it cold. But I feel like there were a whole bunch of steps that you were unveiling that show us that it's not just the simple calculus of keeping it fresh. As you mentioned, there's this whole element of like making it the way that we expect to have it. And then I'd love to hear your thoughts on some of the lab grown meat and how that's how refrigeration, what role it impacts or how it plays a role in that type of meat production too.
So the meat chapter is quite gruesome, but also strangely fascinating. And one of the weirdest things I think is this business of electrostimulation. And I think most people have no idea. They know meat is refrigerated, but they don't realize that we have to give our meat essentially a giant electric shock after it's been slaughtered. It's like it jerks around on the rail like a piñata at a party. It's really there's a reason they don't allow videos in slaughterhouses, and this is one of the reasons. But what is happening is that electric shock is making the muscles contract rapidly enough to use up all the calcium that is sort of when your muscles contract, it's a little calcium pump that's telling them to do that. That's what's activated. You need that little release of calcium. That has to be drained before the meat gets down to below 50 degrees, because at 50 degrees, that calcium pump fails. And what happens is it floods the entire muscle with the signal to contract. And what happens then is like the meat literally is just like and all bunches up. And you can imagine exactly how tough that is. It is as bad as it sounds. And it's just an amazing and weird thing. It's called cold shortening when that happens. And it was discovered in the 70s in New Zealand, when really for the first time our refrigeration started to be powerful enough to make, you could kill slaughter some cattle and cool it down to below 50 within a couple of hours. And so in that time, the calcium hadn't drained away. The muscles were still capable of contracting. They still had the response. And so if you took it below 50, it would bunch up. And it took a lot of work to figure out. And it's just, so now the solution is electrocute, which fascinatingly makes the meat much more tender. Was sort of discovered by Ben Franklin accidentally many many years earlier, but in a whole separate story. But it's just a weird phenomenon where you realize everything about how our meat gets to us is sort of predicated on a whole set of things that have had to be worked out, very sort of intricate protocols that we're utterly oblivious to. So another thing is, meat does need to age a little, like the enzymes, again, biochemical processes that are turning that muscle into meat need to happen in the cold. But because in the post-war era, people figured out how to make that happen in a vacuum sealed bag rather than having the carcass hang in a cold space for several days, which is what used to happen before. Now it can happen inside a vacuum sealed bag. And so you just slaughter, cut up, put it in a vacuum sealed bag, and it can age on its way to market. And so it doesn't have to hang and dry age. It does something called wet aging in its own juices. And again, this is just, it's something that you don't think about. It revolutionized where meat is slaughtered because suddenly you don't have to have butchers doing it. It's all just chopped up at the slaughterhouse, which means you can monetize a lot more of the byproducts, which is how you end up with things like pink slime and all of these restructured meat products that come out after the war. And so all of the ripple effects that come out of that, let alone the fact that wet aged meat doesn't taste the same as dry aged meat, it just sort of ends up having these huge effects, really fascinating science. And again, I had been writing about and broadcasting about food for so long at this point, and I was like, how do I not know any of this?
And then, that gets us to the lab grown meat. Like, to what extent? And I think a lot of people who kind of go into, or who, especially the consumers of lab grown meat, think about, well, this is much better for the environment. It's potentially, if it's engineered, to be healthier, maybe it can avoid some of the pitfalls that we know red meat can have on our health. But to what extent do people who create lab grown meat know about all of these tips and tricks from the meat industry that could influence the taste?
It's so interesting because they don't, for the most part. And it's also kind of fascinating because cultivated meat, one of the reasons you have to refrigerate, it's such a health issue to refrigerate meat, is because it's not necessarily sterile and you don't want microbes growing on it. Well, cell cultured meat is theoretically sterile. And so could it be refrigerated at a different temperature? Also theoretically possible. And so that's actually when we were visiting Just Foods for an episode of Gastropod, because I'm obsessed with refrigeration, I asked, the scientists there, and they said it seems like we can actually keep it at a slightly warmer temperature. and not risk, microbial growth. It seems like for food safety reasons, you don't have to keep it as cold. Well, that would have a huge impact. I mean, maybe on
Mm-hmm.
flavor, we don't know, but also definitely environmentally and on energy usage. So, but it doesn't get factored in because, again, people are so busy thinking about how we grow food, which is important, but
Mm-hmm.
one of the meat scientists I spoke to said, how you treat meat after it's slaughtered in terms of temperature and atmosphere and all of this, that has a bigger impact on its flavor than anything you can do before it's slaughtered. So it's really important. It's just sort of overlooked.
And as I was reading about you have this whole sort of section called a third pole. And just as you mentioned, like 5.5 billion cubic, I don't know, feet, meters, can't remember.
Feet.
Feet. It's like this massive amount that, the environmental impact. I mean, I think we all recognize there is a big environmental impact in the growing, say, of, animals for food, of the transportation of food from one place to another. But the actual refrigeration component seems like, almost from my reading of your book, like the most important or the biggest environmental consideration. So
It's really up there. And again, this was another thing where I was like, have I got this right? Because when I first wrote about this, it was for about this, the contribution of refrigeration to climate change. It was actually for an article for the New York Times Magazine, and I had gone to China because China, you know how China does these things. They made refrigerating the country sort of item number 3 in their 12th 5-year plan. And so they just did it like overnight, whereas, the US sort of did it over a span of 70 years. And so I was like, wow, this is an amazing opportunity to see what happens to a country and its food system as it goes from unrefrigerated to refrigerated. So I went there, I profiled the world's first frozen dumpling billionaire. I wrote this story. But the fact checker for the New York Times Magazine was like, all your numbers on the emissions and the climate change issues and the global warming impact of this, like, they seem to be correct, but I can't find anyone else writing about this. Like, they didn't want to. And I was like, I know. And it wasn't until after that piece came out and a couple of scientists came up to me at a cold chain industry conference and were like, oh my God, like I've been handing this piece out. Like, no one believes me that this is an issue. And it was a few years, like 3 or 4 years after that, that the UN put together its first committee on sustainable cooling, like addressing this as an issue. And I was the keynote at their first meeting. So it really was something that, again, I think of myself as like a knowledgeable eater and someone who cares a lot about climate change and was aware of, the climate impact of my food choices. And this is a big blind spot, I think, because it seems so necessary. Like we have to have it. But yes, it contributes to climate change in 2 main ways. It's the energy required to run refrigeration machinery, which, sure, yeah, it could all theoretically be sustainably sourced, but we aren't growing that fast enough even for our current uses, let alone, this enormous cold chain we're building. And it turns out that, unfortunately, the chemicals that we use in our refrigeration machinery, so the refrigerants, the ones that we pump around and evaporate so that they absorb the heat that is in our fridges or our warehouses, etc., many of those turn out to be super greenhouse gases, so many hundreds or even thousands of times more warming than carbon dioxide, and they all leak from the machines at a certain rate, either a lot or a little, depending on how well they are maintained. And if that's not, already bad enough, unfortunately, the US cold chain is expanding and the rest of the world is beginning to build a US style cold chain. So the emissions projections for refrigeration, the actual figures are already kind of terrifying. They're up there with aviation. But the projections are that cooling for food alone will have a global warming impact higher than food waste. And food waste right now we know is like if food waste was a country, it'd be the third highest emitter after the US and China. So it's this enormous kind of ticking time bomb. It's bad enough already, and we're building more of it, and it will become more polluting in a warmer world because it will take more energy to cool in a warmer world. And so it's sort of a crisis, and yet it isn't on most people's radar, and it's certainly not getting, the R&D funding that it needs. I mean, I think it's one of my experts told me he called it the Cinderella of R&D. He was like, I think it's less than 1% gets spent on cooling, let alone alternate methods of food preservation.
And I think this is really becoming important to people who are noticing that there are all these links with ill health effects in processed foods. And of course, the main reason that we have hyper-processed foods is because they have preservatives, right? They are able to preserve without
Shelf
having to
life.
be refrigerated. They have a shelf life. And that it seems like if that's bad for us and we all turn to quote unquote fresh food, that's also not good. Like that
I
sounds
know.
like it's not the solution necessarily.
It is scary. I mean, even I have seen, people with pet food. Pet food used to be a shelf stable thing. You would get the kibble
Mhm.
or whatever, or the cans, and now everyone feeds their pet refrigerated, fresh food.
Mm.
So there's a real move to incorporating, fresh food where fresh means refrigerated. And what I try to do at the end of the book is say, we actually really need to rethink what fresh means. In America, we believe that fresh means it's refrigerated. But
Mhm.
actually, fresh just means it has more of the things in it that it had when it was harvested, So
Mhm.
you want a strawberry that's as close as possible to what it was when it was picked from the plant. And we want something that's not bad. So the microbes and fungi have not had a chance to reproduce in our milk, for example. Well, there are lots of ways to achieve those goals. Cold is one of them. It's the one we've adopted wholesale. It works terrifically well. It just has costs. And so, what I tried to do with the book is say, in cases like, let's have an accounting of those costs. Let's look at the alternatives and let's see if we can't, in some cases, do a little better. Like, does our strawberry have to be cold? It does not have to be cold. It just needs to be fresh. Your ice cream needs to be cold. Your strawberry doesn't. So, if there's a way of preserving it with those nutrients that doesn't take an energy intensive cold chain, wouldn't that be great?
Mhm. Also, yeah, the ice cream comment reminded me of the fact that it was like something like 50% of your kind of less expensive, less high quality ice cream is air, and so you can't stack ice cream. That's what got me back to your.
It
It's
was
like, wait,
one of
what? You
the
can't
things
what?
I learned in the warehouse. You cannot stack like anything like the premium brands like Ben and Jerry's whatever, sure, but otherwise it's 50% air and it will crush
Yeah.
literally under the weight as you stack it. That's also why they can't ship ice cream across the country because if it goes over the Rockies, it will explode.
Yeah, I know. That's what I was like.
So
It was like, and it was like amongst your Americold, colleagues, friends, peers, they were like, "Yeah, of course you can't do that." And I was like, "Wait, what? You can't have like Colorado ice cream in Wisconsin?"
listen,
No.
the people who work on the post-harvest side of the food chain, they know food in a completely different way from the rest of us. I mean,
Yeah.
it's the same with fruit and vegetables. I mean, I remember Natalia Falagan, who's a post-harvest physiologist who works on exactly how to tailor, um, you know, your individual cooling regime to like a blueberry versus, a potato versus an apple. She was like, "Oh yeah, like the fridge is the stone fruit killing zone." Who knew? I mean, I've never put a peach in the fridge again, but they have this understanding of the physiology of our food, things like what it actually is and what you're
Mhm.
trying to do to preserve it, that is just even the most ardent foodie, who knows the name of the farmer who like raised their chickens doesn't know. And so it was totally fascinating for me because I had felt, I was super jealous when like things like Omnivore's Dilemma came out. I was like, ah, I wish I could have written that. But I was like, there's a whole other side. If Michael Pollan showed us the feedlot and opened a lot of our eyes to this world we hadn't realized and how our cows were raised, well, there's a whole other side. What happens after they've been slaughtered is equally weird and wonderful,
Well, then
Wonderful.
it reminds me of the visual of the New York's underground bananas.
Yeah. I mean, the banana ripening rooms, the explosions, the juice tanks. There's just when you go and visit, like Tropicana, fresh, not from concentrate orange juice, and you go and see the tanks that it's stored in, which are these, they hold like 1.5 Olympic pools worth of juice. They're like giant ice cream mixers. Sort of, they have this paddle going around in the middle, and then a layer of nitrogen on top of the tank to keep it, quote unquote, fresh, keeps oxygen away. They've been de-oiled, and de-aerated, which basically strips out all the flavor. Literally everything that is left is sugar and water. That is it. It tastes of nothing. And they add that back in in a room at the end. It's called literally the Flavor Plus room. And it's just, the flavors come from oranges. So you don't have to say, oh, this is, flavored juice. But it's not the orange that originally, it's not any orange you would find in nature. It's the flavor of Tropicana that's being added back in, the same every single day. And so it's just again, of course, like if you drink freshly squeezed orange juice, it tastes different and in different months. I live in LA. I have an orange tree in my back garden. I know that the juice I get off that in January tastes different than the juice in April. And that's just one tree, let alone different varieties and different orchards and ones that are south facing versus north facing. But your Tropicana tastes the same every single carton. And again, It's one of those things where you're like, I'd never really thought about that, but that's not right.
You're exactly right. Like there's like you have this feeling that I want to be able to buy this thing from the grocery store and know exactly how it's going to taste. But anytime you have two different oranges or two different grapefruits, like it's a bit of a gamble, right?
Right.
One might be sweet and might not be. So to expect juice to always taste the same like that, I had never thought of that. And then like to think now, I just imagine like it's actually essence of orange. It's like you have like sugar water and then they like spray perfume on it to make you believe that this is orange flavored. As I don't think I can ever buy Tropicana again.
It did kind of put me off. I have to say, yeah. It's my Gastropod co-host Cynthia and I joke about this all the time. But like, the more you know, the less you can eat sometimes.
So you also end the book with a section called "The End of Cold," and you have two. I think to me it was amusing. You have one chapter called "The Future of Refrigeration," and then the next chapter is "The Future May Not Be Refrigerated." So,
thank you.
Where do you stand now in terms of like, this is a podcast where we try to help people make decisions on the basis of the science that can impact society. So, although you mentioned that there is this trend of increased refrigeration and increased cold chaining across the world, we are also living in a warming climate. So how do people make decisions about their food that is both climate friendly and healthy?
Well, so I think one of the things that's easiest for an individual is to think about just more realistically about what you're going to eat and when. So this is the downfall of the American, mega fridge. It looks empty when you have a perfectly reasonable amount of food in it. And so you tend to buy more, and you tend to want to buy lots of fruits and vegetables because you say to yourself, if I have them around, I'll eat them. And then at the end of the week or, 10 days later, you throw them out. And so I think on an individual basis, having, shopping more frequently for the food you are actually going to eat will give you it's a huge climate impact. It'll also give you tastier and more nutritious food. I mean, when you eat that bag of spinach, a week after you've bought it, it may not have gone bad. You may be patting yourself on the back. Hooray. I ate the bag of spinach. It will have pretty much a quarter of the nutrients it had when you bought it. So the fridge is not a bank vault. It's it is not keeping things exactly as they were. They are still dying while they're in your fridge, and so using it to stockpile and hoard out of this sense of wanting to have everything there is not a great way to go. And I feel like, well, people are like, oh, I can't shop every day. That's where your freezer comes in, because actually the freezer is pretty much a bank vault. I mean, things will eventually go bad, but you have much longer to play with. So if you really feel anxious without having vegetables on standby, that's how to do it. But also, I just feel bigger picture. Thinking about what needs to be in the cold and what doesn't, and as a society, thinking about how can we reduce our reliance on this. I mean, our homes used to be built so that they had root cellars, so that they had pantries with cold areas, meat safes. They aren't anymore. There's a designer I profile in the book whose project is called Save Food from the Fridge, and she has designed sort of some of these like storage for carrots that actually keeps them longer and better than a fridge does, and also makes them visible in your kitchen. It's not practical. This is not something you can go out and buy right now, but I think it's more of a way of saying, let's raise awareness around this. And frankly, if people are looking to work on solutions, big picture, this is the area that needs it. Everyone is pouring their money into AI and GLP-1 drugs, but how we preserve our food, it's been one of the most important questions humans have had to answer since the dawn of time. We invented refrigeration and basically we're just like, okay, that's it, we're done. And the point of my book is like, no, we're not. We can do better. We have to do better. But we can also do better. It's not just like, oh God, disaster, avert the, like climate change. It's also that our food could be more nutritious, more delicious. There's a ton of fruits and vegetables we don't get in the supermarket right now because they don't stand up to a cold chain. Everyone knows that supermarket tomatoes taste like nothing. Well, that's because of how they're harvested and shipped under refrigeration and have been bred for that. So I'm just saying we could have more delicious and nutritious food as well as food that's better for the planet. And all of it relies on coming up with new methods of food preservation.
So one of the things, like, in addition to it's just fun to read and really interesting that I loved about your book, is that it does seem to have this like practical application that people can do right now. They can figure out what, like, as soon as we get off this podcast, I'm running to get my stone fruit out of the fruit drawer and figuring out a way to store my carrots more effectively. Because you're exactly right. Like, there's no reason that they need to all be in this one location. And you can think about reorganizing your kitchen to optimize for the nutritional value and so forth. And so I just want to remind our listeners that Nikki's book, Frostbite, How Refrigeration Changed Our Food, Our Planet, and Ourselves, is now available at booksellers everywhere. It's been a long time in the making, so go out and buy it immediately, although I'm sure it will have a very long shelf life. So, sorry, is that way too many jokes?
That was amazing. I hope you're right. But yeah, it's nice and fresh right now. So get it while it's fresh.
It sure is. Nikki, thank you so much for coming back on Inquiring Minds.
Thank you for having me. It's so much fun to talk with you, always.
So that's it for another episode. Thanks for listening. If you want to hear more, don't forget to subscribe. If you'd like to get an ad-free version of the show, consider supporting us at patreon.com/inquiringminds. I'd like to thank our long-term supporters, David Noel, Herring Chang, Yushi Lin, Jay Henry, Joel, and Charles Weil. Inquiring Minds is produced by Why Not Alchemy, and I'm your host, Indre Viscontis. See you next time.